Hello, all, and welcome, welcome. This is the Guild Literary Complex, and today, or tonight rather, we have a reading with Aviya Kushner on her new work, Wolf Lamb Bomb, and I am happy to report this just in, news, news, news. Wolf Lamb Bomb was just named new and noteworthy in the New York Times. How exciting is that?
Amazing.
I know, right? So I'm Andrea Change. I'm the executive director for the Guild Literary Complex and your host for this evening. I also want to do a special thank you to the Seminary Co-op for co-sponsoring us and being our bookseller this evening. If you would like to buy the books, there will be a link in the chat. In addition to hearing from Aviya, we'll also be joined by fellow author and translator Adriana X Jacobs. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about our author this evening. Aviya Kushner grew up in a Hebrew-speaking home in New York. She is author of author of the book The Grammar of God: A Journey into the Words and Worlds of the Bible, with Penguin Random House, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist, a Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literary finalist, and one of the Publishers Weekly top 10 religion stories of the year. She is the Forward's language columnist and previously wrote a travel column for the International Jerusalem Post. Her work has been supported by the Howard Foundation, the Illinois Arts Council, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and she is associate professor at Columbia College Chicago, where she directs the MFA program in creative writing. And this book, Wolf Lamb Bomb, is her first full-length collection into poetry. So I want to welcome her. And then I want to tell you a little bit about who will be joining us this evening. Adriana X Jacobs is Associate Professor of Modern Hebrew Literature at the University of Oxford and author of Strange Cocktail, Translation and the Making of Modern Hebrew Poetry from 2018. Her translations of Hebrew poetry have appeared in Gulf Coast, Anomaly, World Literature Today, North American Review, among others, as well as the collection of Women's Hebrew Poetry on American Shores, poems by Kleinman, and Annabelle Farmland in 2016. She's also translated The Truffle Eye from Van Wen, who is, interestingly enough, a Vietnamese Israeli who writes in Hebrew, and she's translated that work. That was published this year with Zephyr Press, and she's currently translating Tahal Frosh Avarice with the support of the NEA Translation Grant. So I want to say welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you. We're delighted to be here. It's so lovely to see all of these faces. And just, Andrea, thank you so much for putting this event together. We're so excited to be here. And of course, with Seminary, a bookstore we love so, so, so much. So it's wonderful to be here tonight.
Yeah, it was interesting because you've actually participated in one of our events in the past in Brooks Day, and what I know you were friends with Lisa Wagner, who was our former executive director, and then I don't know, I don't remember, but I had the best time. She invited me to be in her class and talk to her class, and this was a Zoom thing, so trust me, it was already daunting to sort of walk into a classroom, but to walk in the classroom, a Zoom class was even more interesting. But your class was so receptive, and we had like the best conversation. And I have to say that when people say you're the nicest person, genuinely, Aviya is like the nicest person. It's like a weird thing and cliche, but she's like the nicest person. And we just recently found out that we're neighbors, so I'm excited about that.
That's right. It's super exciting. Thank you. Well, it was so wonderful to have you in my class. I taught our first ever course on Chicago's literary communities, and I want to acknowledge. I see Mike, poet Mike Puikan, who was here, was also a terrific visitor to my class and helped give the students a sense of the wide range and diversity of Chicago's literary communities. So it's great to have you both.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the book. First of all, I enjoyed reading it. It was such a pleasure and very reflective of your personality, I should say a little bit. And but tell us about the title of the book and what the origin of the book is.
Sure. Well, This book took a long time, but it started a very long time ago. I want to acknowledge my sister, who I see will remember this time period in our lives. When my grandfather died, I was devastated. I was in my early 20s. I think I was 23, and I just felt like there was nothing for a grandchild to do. You know, so in Jewish tradition, there's Shiva for certain relatives, and then there's Kaddish if you're a close relative. But grandchildren, like nobody cares. It doesn't matter. And I was very upset by that because I felt very close to our grandfather and I wanted to do something to honor him. So I made up my own ritual. I went to synagogue every week for a year on time. And those who know me know I am not a morning person. Very hard for me to be somewhere early in the morning on time, but I did it for a year. And one of the things that I realized was I was just finishing poetry graduate school, and so I was sort of in poetry mode. And when I saw the book of Isaiah in synagogue, I started thinking of it as poetry. That was really how it struck me because I was reading poems all the time. And I just thought, wow, this is amazing poetry. Forget about the biblical side. This is incredible poetry. And I want to learn from Isaiah as a poet. So that was one of the things that really struck me. And actually, my mother reminded me of something that by now I had forgotten. She reminded me that toward the end of my grandfather's life, he could no longer walk to synagogue and he was distressed that he couldn't hear. In the summer there are these beautiful weeks where you hear parts of the book of Isaiah out loud in synagogue for 8 straight weeks, and he was distressed that he couldn't hear it. And so my brother read it for him on his porch, and that memory of this sort of seeing like the emptiness of the Galilee where my grandfather lived, his house looked out into this bare landscape that was really, really beautiful, and just sort of hearing it alone, just a lone voice in the wilderness, I think that really stuck with me, and that was the beginning of these poems.
Well,
And
so for those of us heathens who are not familiar, Isaiah is part of the Old Testament,
yes,
and we were talking before. In the when I grew up going to church, Isaiah was considered part of the storytelling part of the Bible. So it wasn't necessarily the same viewpoint that you have. So I was enlightened by that, and I almost picked up the Bible and started reading Isaiah. And then I was like, "Where's my Bible?" So
yeah. Well, one of the things that I discovered while writing these poems for years and years is that Isaiah means different things to different people in different traditions. And that was something that I did not know growing up because I grew up in an all Jewish town. And so in Jewish tradition, Isaiah is very much a prophet. In Jewish tradition, the Bible, the Tanakh, is divided into three parts: the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, which are the prophets. So in addition to Isaiah, it will be Jeremiah, all those prophetic voices. And then there's Ketuvim, which are the writings, and that would be, all sorts of random, but also a book of Ruth, things like that. Like the writings, those are at the end. So there's three separate categories. But I have personally always loved the prophets, which are the second of the three big trio in Jewish tradition. And I think the reason that I've always loved the prophets, first of all, I think they're the most poetic section of the Bible, with the possible exception of the Psalms. But also, I think that the prophets are about, I'm going to borrow a line from Barack Obama. So, Barack Obama in his speeches would always talk about the world as it is and the world as it should be. And I always think that's Isaiah's highway: what is and what should be. That's a prophetic understanding of the world. And I think that prophetic vision is very appealing to us, even thousands of years later. This idea that, there's something that should be. And I think that, as I saw, violence in Israel, and as I saw the aftermath of September 11th, and as I saw all sorts of things, I started to think about what is and what should be. And that's Isaiah. So I felt like I had a partner in that conversation in Isaiah as a writer.
well, you had a third partner in your grandfather. It sounds like
Right.
in that process. So I want to give you a chance to sort of read a little bit from the work, if you could, and if you.
Sure. I'd be happy to. But first, I just wanted to quickly answer your question about the title, because it
Oh
took
yeah.
forever to come up with this title. Forever. And it was one of my problems. I sort of called these poems the Isaiah poems, and I hated that title. And I know you need a great title. And, you know, this book plays with lines from Isaiah. So, of course, an iconic line is "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb," right? It's a very iconic line. But I think it's also about personal history, my personal history, and just, world history, communal history. And so, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb" is a, really it's sort of idyllic vision of the way things should be, right? The way things should be. But we know that that's not really the way things are. So I started to think that what I wanted these poems to be, I started to think about the term still life from or naturmort in art, and how it's both dead and alive at the same time. And that was how I felt about these verses, that they were both past and present at the same time. So I started to think, okay, still life with wolf and lamb. And then I was like, no, 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 that's not true. There's a bomb. I saw it over and over and over again. And so I just started to get to wolf, lamb, and bomb. And then my wonderful friend Curtis Bauer, who's a poet and translator, was like, nope, it's wolf, lamb, bomb with no commas. So that's how I got there to answer the question. And it was really, that's really what it is. It's this idyllic vision that's disrupted by a bomb. Okay, so I'm super excited to be here. I'm going to start us off with three poems just to set the scene for the book, give you a sense of what's happening. And then I'm going to move forward. I'm going to restart with three short poems. So the first poem I'm going to read is called The Book of Isaiah, and it's the frontispiece of the book, just to set it up. It goes like this. The Book of Isaiah. For years, I wanted to be that angry, and for it to be that beautiful. I loved the poetry of rage. And now, all I can remember are the hills. I can hear the fire in them, words shaking earth. Even a bull knows its owner, an ass its master. Hear, heavens, give ear, O earth. And I'm reading that because one of the things that attracted me to Isaiah was how comfortable he is with anger and how he makes anger beautiful. And I think that in our society, women and many other people are not allowed to be angry. So I was very interested in that. How can you be angry? The second poem I'm going to read is an example of how my life and Isaiah's life kind of twisted together a little bit. I wrote this poem when I needed to say no to someone and I didn't know what to say. It's called Music. Music. Like a lyre, my head moans for the girls who are taken, the young wives. And I cannot decide if I too want to be a wife, bound and also protected, or if I would rather be a lone crooner in the wilderness, there not by choice, but by a wire, a flame, a pillar, a force of earth. Art is a religion, some say, with a sad nod of their heads, but I think it is also a wife and husband, a God whoa, and servant, friend and sweet master, music and moan. Okay, so that sneeze was not planned. Um, Moving forward, so this sort of gets to, Andrea, what you were talking about before, and this idea that your understanding of Isaiah wasn't my understanding of Isaiah. And that was actually something that I first started to think about when a woman came up to me in a Panera Bread in Iowa City and asked me what I was doing. And I said I was writing Isaiah poems. And she said from the Christian perspective. And I really didn't know what she was talking about. I really didn't know what that meant. So this is a poem about the figure of Isaiah and how he seems to other people, not just to me. It's called Rumor. Rumor. There's a crazy man in those hills howling that he can comfort us all. There's an old crazy man in all of us saying, I raised you, made you tall, and you rebellious little wuss, you forgot that an ox who knows him, and an ox knows who owns him, an ass knows his place. Rain falls and we rain blame the way our ancestors rained blame. Bombs explode in a faraway city where I once lived, and the world rains its curses on man, on God, on the whole idea of I will be what I will be. I am what I am. That tenses because I am past and present and future, and I breathe you into you. Listen, someone once said, I am comforting you, breathing through an old, towering prophet who is nothing but a singer on a stage, a singer when there is only one light left and the soft illusion of a face. In a few years, you too will be just rumor, a fire, dry grass, a singer who sang and then disappeared from the lilt of performance, the light of the audience, the light of the world, a balm to the crazy, the rebel, the wuss, Isaiah to the nations of the earth, like the tale of an old crazy man in the hills, a song and a howl, a wolf and a lamb, a story everyone claims. And I wrote that because I noticed that everyone seemed to have some kind of tie to Isaiah. Everyone had their own personal sense of the book of Isaiah. So those were some of the things that stuck out to me. So that's just to set up the book and sort of this situation that I had where I was thinking all the time about an ancient writer, and it just didn't seem that ancient. It seemed like it was happening right there to me, to my life, and to people that I knew. So I'm going to move forward and I'm going to read a few poems, all of which, 3 poems, all that make sense of current events or of history. And one of the things that I was interested in was the narrow line, the line between history and contemporary event, the line between journalism and personal opinion, the line between poetry and translation. So all the poems I'm going to read going forward are going to tread on that narrow line. And I hope now that we're set up with the idea of the book, that line will be clear. And I think also if you've been breathing for the past couple of decades, you'll recognize these events. Okay, so the first poem I'm going to read is called Smoke, and it gives me great pleasure to have the opportunity to read in a bookstore in Hyde Park, where I know that there's the Oriental Institute, there's a lot of interest in the ancient. So I feel like this is probably the only place on earth where I can read a poem that mentions Sennacherib and people will know who it is. Okay, so I'm really excited to have a chance to spotlight Sennacherib. And I will also say that the book of Isaiah has a lot of villains, a lot of rulers who are very violent, who killed people. And when I first started reading Isaiah in that year that my grandfather died, I have to say that they felt very far away. I was like, who are these ogres? Who are they? And how do they? Makes no sense. And it felt a lot like my grandfather's description of Hitler. It felt very, very far. When he was a boy, he was sent to listen to Hitler, and he sat under the bench, but unfortunately, with the rise of authoritarianism in the past couple of years, I have to say that these ancient rulers feel a lot more contemporary to me, and they feel a lot more real. So Sennacherib doesn't feel that crazy to me anymore. So this poem is called Smoke. Smoke. God will empty the land of you. The sword will rule your fields. Sennacherib will come and remove 10/12 of you, and you'll cry. Oh, you will cry, and you'll say, this is the end. There is no more. But no, this is the beginning of comfort. And I remember the days after the disaster, how quiet it was on the highways, how drivers let others pass, how even the Hudson seemed to mourn, and how we began to be thankful for mother and father and land and wallet in that order, and how the smoke was followed by a mild winter, and how everything seemed more beautiful, I suppose, and temporary after the sword, after the worst. That was just, after September 11th, New York was extremely quiet and eerily quiet. And that was one of the things that interested me there. The next poem I'm going to read, I get asked a lot, how do you write essays and poems and what's the line, what's da-da-da? And I'm going to read a poem that made me turn to nonfiction, actually. And the reason is that it was the Second Intifada. There was a lot of violence of all kinds, but this particular one really got to me. It was a bombing in the Dolphinarium in Tel Aviv, and there were two. Almost everyone who was killed was under 18 because it was a nightclub for teenagers. But there were two sisters who were killed, and one of my jobs at that time was to interview child victims of terror. And so I was sent by the newspaper I was working with to interview. He was 14 years old. He was the brother of those two, and at the time, my youngest brother was 14 years old. And I did my job. I got the quotes, and then I just could not stop thinking about this kid. I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I went back over and over and over and over again. And one of the things that I thought about is, whatever the headlines are, the news cycle moves on, but this is people's lives continue. You know, people's lives continue, no matter how you feel, whatever. And that is often not in the newspaper. It's not part of journalism. And it really bothered me. I started to think about aftermath. And so went back several times and I talked to the boy. And years later, I realized that in my zeal to talk to this little boy, I had walked right past his mother over and over again. And I never really got her side of, I never thought about her. And so, but I can also say that that experience of thinking about aftermath and how we don't go back years later sent me to essays to have the opportunity to think about that. So I'm just going to read this poem, which is sort of built on my mistake and thinking about how I never thought about the mother. I only thought about the little boy. It's called Disco. And like the other poems in the book, it's built on one line from the book of Isaiah. Disco, tell me, who made the world lie in waste? Who wrecked the villages one by one until only a lone woman was left? Smoke and fire, music, and the tick, tick, tick of aftermath. In the whitewashed apartment, a mother of two girl dancers has no hair to slick into buns, no necklaces to fasten at the neck. The bomb's cheap trick to unclasp it all. Who cocked the trigger? Who flicked the switch? Who rang the cell phone that flipped life into explosion? Once I was a singer who sang into the black night of the dance floor, the crystal ball shine of it. Now I alone am left to tell. I alone still have two legs to walk out into the flowerless world. I have left the village of my isolation to tell you I was a lone woman singing, dancing in the tick, tick, tick of the wreck, holding the word delphinarium, saying daughters, anklets, daughters, saying this dance of a world was once my world, this wreck is my world. And then another example of thinking about the line between the ancient and the contemporary, the line between history and personal history, is this poem. It's called Rereading Chapter 11. It comes toward the end of the book, and you'll see in a minute. And I think it goes back to that question that you asked me early on about the title, about wolf and lamb. And you'll see again that the iconic wolf and lamb appear again as just something that I thought about a lot. Okay, rereading chapter 11. Something is about to dry up the tongue of the Egyptian sea, just seconds after it looked like the wolf and the lamb were about to lounge together. And that's what frightens me, that God or whoever can just dry it all up, take it all away, which is what happened to the brother of the builder of my parents' house, who had his tongue cut out of his mouth at Auschwitz, which sent him into a life without sound, a sentence of being misunderstood. I think of the tongueless man every year on Yom Kippur, the holiest of the holy days, and what makes me tremble are the words, Lord, open my lips and let my mouth utter your praises. Humble it's supposed to sound, and I know I need to ask for that opening of the lips. And then I remember the lines before that, man has the inner workings of the heart, and God owns the tongue. But I want the tongue. That's all I want, to have one body part that is mine alone, to say, God, take it all, control the land, rule over me all my life, but don't take that. No, no, don't cut my tongue out, not that. So I guess I thought a lot about, this was someone I saw when I was a child. He used to make unintelligible sounds in the playground, and I didn't understand why he couldn't talk. And later I realized what had happened to him. And I guess I just became I just thought about, there's tragedy, there's violence, there's history, but people have to live with it for the rest of their lives. And that was, I thought, what was really interesting to me. I'm going to end this section with two poems that are about who's really original, okay? Who's really original? Because this is a book that lives between Isaiah and the present tense. So who owns it? Who gets it? And I'm going to read two takes on that, and then stop for some questions and see how we do. So once again, I think I was saying that the book of Isaiah has these awful rulers, and it's just a pleasure to be able to think about them for a minute. It's called Ode to Arrogance. With the strength of my arm, I did this. With my wisdom, with my understanding. The lie of original poetry as big as the watermelon big heart of Sennacherib, big old arrogant king of Assyria who roared, the nations I conquered were lying before me like abandoned eggs. So many nations, like soil. There was so much soil and no one energetic enough to claim it. So I picked up the earth, I lifted it, I turned it over. Ha! How you laugh at me, Isaiah. Ha, hoy, ha. In Hebrew and translated English, you guffaw. The axe does not boast, the saw does not strut. Take the words I gave you, softly play with the black soil of Iowa, so fertile it makes farmers weep. Repeat this, you are just the guardian. Your name long and unpronounceable as Assyria. Your stay in this state of wilderness brief. Your arm at the rake and your wrist at the shovel, as fleeting, as hilariously dependent as Sennacherib. So I thought about that, even with Putin going into countries taking over, it's the same thing. I own this, I can do this, nobody can stop me. And I found that very interesting. And I also thought about it in terms of poetry and translation. What do you own? What's yours? What's not yours? And so I thought about that a lot, not just in terms of geopolitics, but as a writer and as a person, what is your what's really yours? And so the last poem I'll read before we stop is about a question that I get a lot, which is, why do you write in this language? Or why don't you write in that language? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And how do you answer that? So this poem is called Why Don't You Write in Hebrew? It's a question I ask myself a lot. And who knows, maybe I'll change my mind, but this is my answer. Why don't you write in Hebrew? Because I'm afraid of you, Isaiah. Afraid I'll hear the 6 wings, 2 to cover the face, and 2 to cover the legs, and 2 to fly. And I ask, how can I praise wings that cover feet and face? And how can I curse when you have already cursed with your carcasses of sleazy financiers, with your ugly and public debts for those who squeeze the poor, the widowed, the temporarily weak? You ask me to compete head on with you, and I can't because I cannot hear in your presence. You thunder so in the space inside my left ear that I cannot forget you, even for the length of a line, the weight of a tear. Thank you.
So that was awesome. It's funny. As I was reading the book over the last few days, one of the things that I thought was interesting was, and maybe because I sort of glommed on that one thing about your grandfather, but I felt like the poems were questioning. Like in my mind, I envisioned a small Aviya and a big Isaiah, and you were just like talking to him and sort of pleading with him and saying, "Why is this? And is this way?" And sort of like a precocious child, sort of constantly questioning. So after the first question, you would ask another question and another question. I feel like each poem is a question, and I'm wondering if you got the answer to those questions as you were divulging or diving rather into the book, or as you sort of created it.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. I did feel like I had a lot of questions, and I think these poems were written in a time in my life where it felt like hand-to-hand combat. Like I couldn't figure out which language I was going to write in. I also wasn't sure if it was going to be poetry or prose or how I was going to do it. And I had a lot of questions about how, and also how to write about these, how to write about horrific events and whether I had the right to do so. So it was all sorts of questions like, you know, this little boy lost his sisters. Am I allowed to comment? Am I allowed? You know, beyond just reporting what happened, which was my job, is it okay for me to think about what happened to him? And so absolutely. So I definitely felt that question answer. Andrea, I also think that you are very much feeling something in Jewish tradition, which the commentators on the Bible, many of them work in question and answer format. So when I was a child, for example, I was tested. There's a great commentator called Rashi from the 11th century. And what he does is he gives an answer. And your job as a reader is to figure out what's his question. And so when I was a little girl, I was tested on, can you accurately predict the question? Can you guess the question? I think that's very interesting training for life as a writer, to think about not your opinion, what your answer is, but what's the question? What's the question? And that, I think, allows for a more inclusive and more layered and also more complicated um, work.
That's interesting, and it sort of brings up another question that I had that I'll ask you about later. But I'm drawn to the idea of, well, as writers, as poets, our job is to observe, right? So our job is to sort of give this perspective, as it were. But at the same time, your perspective is a questioning perspective. It's, you know, it's at some point I felt like it was pleading. It was like, Isaiah, give me a break. Tell me what this is supposed to be. And um, but I want to bring Adriana in because we talked about translation, and you talked about the idea of translation. And I've heard this before from another translator that I know, Mary Hawley, who's, and in my mind, of course, translations only occur in Spanish, but they don't. But um, but I remember she was saying something like how you you don't, it's not a strict translation. You know, you don't just write the word and write it back. Part of your job is to sort of give it access, is the word I'm maybe looking for, making it accessible to the other language, or the person reading it in the other language. And when you and Adriana were talking before, we talked about opinion versus I want to say perspective. Well, opinion and perspective, same thing. But you know what, I forget. But Adriana, if you're here, if you could chime in. I know we were having this conversation about how translation impacts the other side of the work.
Right. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for including me in this incredible event. And Aviya, really congratulations. It's such a beautiful book. And I think maybe because I'm a translator and I know you're a translator of poetry, I'm always sort of my antennae sort of are attuned to the translational moments in your poems, not just in the fact that you're working with and in dialogue with Isaiah, so already with a Hebrew text, and you're writing these poems in English, but there's so many moments in these poems where it's like, if you know the source material, you can hear the ways that you're translating. But then there are these moments where you include Hebrew in the Roman alphabet, so transliterated Hebrew, and you sometimes translate it, or you sort of translate it, and sometimes it's not quite translated accurate, precisely. So then, and so then these letters, they don't look like English, they don't look like Hebrew to me anymore. So I love how you sort of bring that into your project. But I guess this is also a question for you, because I think it comes back to Andrea's question about sort of what we're doing as translators. And I can say a bit more of that when I read my translations of Van Wyn. It is part trying to open up something to readers who may not have access to the source material, but you're also, you and I both write poetry, and we're also kind of tempted to sort of do our own thing and give things our own twist and put our own stamp on it. And sometimes that is in tension with being more literal or precise. So yeah, I just throw that back to you, just how consciously you were working with translation in this project.
Sure. And first of all, it's such an honor to be in conversation with such a wonderful translator and scholar. And I also want to acknowledge that I see several amazing translators here. I see award-winning Kay, who is such a wonderful translator of Arabic, right at the top. I see Naomi. I see Susan Harris of Words Without Borders. So it's just really exciting to have folks in the audience who know what translation is and how multi-layered and experienced. Oh, and Neil. Yeah, I'm just not. Yeah, Neil and Natanya. Hello. Okay. Yeah, I'm sure so super, super exciting. And Luke is a translator. And I want to acknowledge my niece, who is certainly bilingual. Okay, but she's okay. Anyway, she's waving. There's my niece. Yes, I must acknowledge. Okay, I think this is something that I thought a lot about, and I knew that you would be able to feel it. So absolutely, some of these poems live, I think, in the space between Hebrew and English, and I think that they're engaged with the tension that I felt as a writer and as a person sort of not being able, I didn't know which language was mine, if either was mine or would ever be mine. And I think that these poems were my sort of way of thinking about all of that. So you will notice that, yes, some of the poems are built on a translation by H.L. Ginsberg, who's a terrific translator of the book of Isaiah. So some of that. Some of that is a very rough translation by me, which may or may not be really that accurate, but I did it as I heard it. I heard it. And then the transliteration is the same thing. Sometimes I was like, I'm not happy with any translation. I'm just going to move to Hebrew for a couple of lines and hopefully people will get it. You know, I'm just going to move it over. So interestingly, I want to credit my teacher, the great poet Robert Pinsky, who was the person who gave me the permission to do that. Robert said to me, he saw that I was struggling. He saw, I think, that I felt linguistically homeless. And Robert said to me, you know, Aviya, what you can do is you can put Hebrew into English. That's what you can do. And in so doing, you can expand the English language. And I think that that's something that comes from, you know, Robert translated Dante. I think comes from someone who has experience with translation. That idea that it's not wrong, it's an expansion. And so some of what you're picking up is that as I got more comfortable, I felt it was okay to slip into just put Hebrew into English, and of course English letters. And then I know we talked before about transliteration, which is fascinating. So transliteration is something that, you know, there are, of course, official academic rules in some languages. There's also a lot of controversy about how you transliterate. Transliterate meaning, how do I write, you know, you can look at my name as an example. Aviya is a Hebrew name. So how do you write it? You put an H at the end? You say Aveeyah? How do you write that? So there's a lot of controversy, and I guess I just decided to wing it with this book, which I know maybe for a scholar may make people crazy, but I just sort of was like, I'm going to wing it. I'm just going to go with how I hear it, and go with that. And then Orison Books, a publisher, has a very interesting style where Orison doesn't italicize. So my original versions were italicized. So in the final version that you see in Wolf Lambach, it's unitalicized because that's the style. But I actually, when I thought about it, I thought, hold on, that style decision is exactly what Robert suggested to me years ago. Just to write it as if it were English. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I've got a question from someone in the audience. They ask, from Jessica, she says, how much are you speaking to Isaiah, telling the prophet about our world, and how much are you serving as an interpreter for Isaiah so he can speak to us?
What an amazing question. What an amazing question. In my head, the phrase I always had was talk back. That was my phrase. Like for a few years, the title of this collection was Talking Back to Isaiah. I always felt that I was responding, that he had sort of made the first salvo and I was responding. So in terms of reporting, I'm not sure if I felt like I was reporting on the present tense, but maybe sort of responding and being like, you know, I see what you were talking about. Okay, I understand what you were saying. This is the riff that I have off your statement. I hope that makes sense. Beautiful question. Yeah, so I guess I always felt like he was first, if that makes sense, that he had set the stage and had set the bar really high. I mean, Isaiah is I think, the best poet I've ever encountered in my life. It's incredible poetry, and also, in, in, I would say the language is incredible, but the plot is also amazing. You know, whether it's not just these rulers who are conquering. Oh, and then you see, you know, the past couple of years, you see that's, I think, you know, Vladimir Putin would totally recognize some of this, the lines in this book, right? Totally reasonable, right? But that sort of dramatic conception of what can happen, and also just this vision I thought was also very elevated. The animals, the fire, the wings, the burning of the lips, it was just tremendous. Yeah, so I guess I felt I was talking back as opposed to reporting, responding as opposed to reporting.
It goes back to the idea sort of questioning and that constant sort of question. It was like if he has a statement, you're like, well, why? But why? but why? And so you're like responding back. But I want to go back to Adriana. Is we were talking about Van Wen and fascinating poet, and you had the chance to translate their work. Can you tell us a little bit about the Truffle Eye, and then if you could read some of your work as well?
Sure. So yeah, so this is the Truffle Eye by Van Wen. This is my reading copy, so it's full of all my little post-its and notes.
Who doesn't have a book like that?
But yeah, so I should say that I've known of Aviya for a very long time. I was a reader of her book reviews in the Jerusalem Post back in the day, and then had the chance to meet her at a couple of conferences, and then later we connected around as translators, really initially. In fact, I think if you're right, Aviya, in your recollection, it was the translator Jessica Cohen who ensured that we meet. So, and then since then, we've just sort of been in touch and become friends and shared a lot of thoughts about this relationship between poetry and translation, and how translation shapes and influences our own writing and our way of thinking about Israel and about Hebrew poetry. And I think also, I should say that I did not grow up in a Jewish home. So my relationship to Hebrew was one that came later and independent of that particular structure. And for me, translating Hebrew poetry has always been a way of sort of remaining connected to the language, to Israeli culture, even when I can't be there. So now I'm going actually quite a long time since I haven't been back to Israel. And I find that for me, the language is sort of the home base for me. Wherever I am, I have the language. I can get books. I can find poems online. And that's how I came to Van. So I was in graduate school. So this was a while back. And I read one of her poems online, and I was completely startled and dazzled by her poetry, and also incredibly intrigued by her background. She was born in Israel to Vietnamese refugees. Her parents were refugees of the Vietnam War, and are part of a very small but actually very connected Vietnamese community in Israel. But Van's connection to that has always been very complicated, because for her, Hebrew is her main language. She's not fluent in Vietnamese. She's been to Vietnam, but she often feels a bit like an outsider there. And then for a lot of other reasons, she also feels like an outsider sometimes in Israel. But I think she's probably best equipped to tell her story. So at some point, I'll link in the chat to a conversation that I had with Van, so you can hear her read her work. It's already almost 2 a.m. in Israel, so she wasn't able to join us, unfortunately. But I was drawn to her work because of also personal reasons. I grew up bilingual, speaking Spanish and English in Northern Virginia. My mother's from Ecuador. She came to the States in the late 60s. I don't think she planned to spend the rest of her life in the United States, but she did, and I was born. And so, so growing up with an immigrant parent who herself, I think, was very ambivalent at times about whether she wanted to remain in the United States, trying to raise her children with her language, but already we were speaking it and with our own accents, and so I think for me, I've always just been drawn to writers and poets who share something of that kind of, at times, really rich, but very, at times, kind of fraught relation to language and place. So I think in that sense, with Van, I felt like there was this something that I wanted to learn from her as a poet, but also something that I connected to personally. So I want to read actually the first poem from her collection, and I'll try to keep track of the time. So this is called, it's a poem called Mekong River. And if you ask Van, she'll say that this is the representative poem of the collection. And because she felt that she might as well open with the book with a poem that deals straight on with identity. She says, that's what people are interested in about me, so I'm going to give them that poem. and then we get it out of the way and we can move on to a lot of other stuff. So I thought that was interesting that she took that particular tack with the book. So this is Mekong River, and actually, you know, I'll read it in Hebrew so you can hear the Hebrew, and then my translation. Nahar HaMekong. הלילה חלפתי על 3 מיטות כמו שטתי במקום, ולחשתי את יפי הפרט וכחי דקל. מתחת לרגע התמיד מחפשת, מתחת לציץ השמאלי, יש לי חור, ואתה ממלא אותו בגברים אחרים, ריח של בירה טייגר על גופך. בבדידות יש רעש ציצרים מדרום ללאוס, ממטרות של אוויר קר מהנוי, הגב מתנשף, הישבן מהודק, כתם דיו על הבטן. צייר לי תרשים זרימה בצבע אחיד, על פרחים טריים באגתן. אשפיך למרגלותיך שורשים, רוצה לגמור, להקיא גרגרי אבק בערוותי. הנח את ידך בתוך תחתוני, תהיה אישי. מי מעז לעזוב מחלה באמצע ים. Mekong River. Tonight, I moved between 3 beds like I was sailing on the Mekong and whispered the beauty of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Under an endless moment, looking below the left tit, I have a hole and you fill it with other men, notes of tiger beer on your body. Alone, crickets drone south of Laos, showers of cold air from Hanoi, the back gasps, the tight ass, an ink stain on the belly. Sketch me a monochrome flowchart on fresh potted flowers. I'll release roots at your feet. I want to come to puke specks of dust in my crotch. Rest your hand in my pants. Make it personal. Who dares abandon a disease mid-sea? So after reading a poem like that, I was like, I have to just translate all of them. But I love just how it opens, you know, that moving between 3 beds, like I'm sailing on the Mekong, but also whispering the beauty of these other rivers. And the Tigris and Euphrates here, some Hebrew readers might pick up a reference to an early 20th century poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, which is called Between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So she's playing around with those associations, but you don't necessarily have to know that to pick up that this is a poem about movement, migration, even a bit of, there's exile in there, and it's all mixed up. I'll read a couple more. So because this event is celebrating Wolf Lamb Baum, and Isaiah is such a prominent, this is an understatement, a prominent voice in the collection, then I want to read a poem where Van quotes from Isaiah. So there's a reference here to Isaiah 56, verse 5. Highway 1. I'll read it in Hebrew because Hebrew, if you know Hebrew, you might pick up the reference when I read it. כביש מספר 1. בכביש מספר 1, אמריקה ניצבת על כת, פסגת ההר מוליקה יד ושם. אוספת תולעים לתפור עבורך שושלת ומסורת. היכן שאני משוטטת ברחובות, מחכה לאבסורד. בדרך אצמח, בדרך אקמול, זר זרדים מעל הראש. On Highway 1, America's fixed on a gun. The hilltop greening, a place and a name. Gathering worms to stitch an ancestry for you and a tradition. On the streets where I wander, I am waiting for the absurd. On the way I'll grow, on the way I'll wither, twigs crowning my head. So this line, a place and a name in Hebrew, Yad Vashem, comes from this Isaiah verse, but it's also Yad Vashem. Some of you may recognize it as the name of the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And so here I had, as a translator, I had to sort of, and Van's playing with all those associations, the biblical verse, also just with the literal meaning, the place and a name, the Yad Vashem, which is literally a hand and a name. And so I opted to italicize, and I used the King James Version in this instance, because I like the idea of the place. I felt that that was important in the poem. But the funny part was that when I read the poem and when I translated it, I thought Highway 1, because of the reference to America, referred to Highway 1 in the United States. And then later I second guessed myself. I thought, no, there's a Highway 1 in Israel. It's the highway connecting Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So certainly she means that Highway 1. And then at the very end, when we were correcting proofs, Vaughn was like, no, that's Highway 1 in Vietnam. So there are a lot of Highway 1s in the world. There's a whole Wikipedia page that's full of them if you're interested. But it does say something, I think, about the position of the translator, sort of where I position myself in relation to these texts. But also, I love the idea of the highway. For me, also evokes something of the way texts circulate and the different roads and paths and highways they move through. And readers will it'll accumulate its own set of associations wherever it sort of travels in the world. Maybe one last poem. This one is called Packing Poem. It's towards the end of the book. Where did I should probably know by heart where these things, 99. Okay, so Packing Poem, which I'll just read in English. In Hebrew, it's Shirat Ariza. And so if you've traveled in and out of Israel, you know that you often have to go through a bit of an interrogation. And one of the very common questions you're asked is, did you pack your bags on yourself? So, arazta or rasta levad. And I think Van is sort of playing with this a bit, but you'll see that the poem involves packings of other kinds. And also, when I was translating, I was thinking about the way poems themselves are kind of like pieces of luggage, and you're throwing a lot of things in there and collecting things, and then the poem wanders off somewhere in the world. And so this is Packing Poem. In the rice bowl, green bananas and peels, dry castor beans in a jar, feathers and mulch outside the window. This is how they still gather evidence. The chopsticks rest diagonally, matching the movement of birds along a waterfall. How can they stall their transmission and keep eating rice before their night migration? Under the cover of delusions, all I wanted was to point and warn everyone, that's Armageddon, to ask whether foreigners have inflatable boats. And those paranoid women have nothing but the gallows for overloading muscles, for stretching the body in the gym. A woman lying naked in the sauna gossips under her breath, and the thoughts escape her all at once. Yes, the meds work. Yes, the mind is numb. But sometimes, if you concentrate, you can hear an airplane landing. I think I'll stop there. Is that all right, Andrew? Or should I skip
I
one
love
more?
that.
I'm excited. That was, I can't tell you how much I appreciated you reading the Hebrew version as well. I always feel like, especially with the translation, and I use the word access, you sort of get that little access. Yeah. And then the other part is, if you're a curious writer or a curious reader, it makes you seek out more stuff. So, just the conversation about Highway 1 existing in 3 different places, and then same thing, Aviya, as you were talking about, I forget what it was suddenly, but again, it makes you, when you were reading those Hebrew lines that sort of dropped into that thing, it made me want to seek out that information more. So yeah, which reminds me, if you could read a few more poems. I know that we talked about some requests. I know that both Adriana and I had some requests, but if the audience has a request, just post it in the chat. But if you could read a few extra pieces.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Adriana, for the beautiful reading. It's so wonderful to hear both the Hebrew and the English. And, for those who don't know, this is such an unusual collection. And, the space between Vietnam and Israel, I think a little known aspect of world history, and between Vietnamese and Hebrew is so interesting. And I just want to recommend Adriana's introductory essay is fantastic and explains everything. So I just want to share that, and I'll have more questions later. I thought that I would close my section with sort of an all request hour. I'm just going to read. I have 4 poems that either Andrea or Adriana asked read. But if there's anything that you want to hear, feel free to just ask in the chat. So I am going to start with ancient Hebrew. And I'm actually really, really happy to read this poem because this is a poem that came out of a mistake. And I think that that's actually something that I also thought a lot about with the grammar of God, that sometimes an incorrect translation can be really beautiful, really, really gorgeous. An example I often give is this old Catholic translation that described the stars as the furniture of heaven. And I've always loved that. Obviously, there aren't chairs and sofas in the sky, but I think it's quite beautiful to think about. And this was something where I was looking at Isaiah in Hebrew, and I misread a line because I didn't look at the vowels beneath the letters, and I misread it. And so this is a poem about that. It's called Ancient Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew, how close the villain is to the harp. Two vowels separate them, just as two small letters separate the harp from the generous. Of course, no one learns languages like this because it's considered wrong, ridiculous. But why that is, that's what I want to know. Yes, the villain can be as mesmerizing as the harp. Yes, evil can seem generous in clever disguise. Yes, all of them have their own rhythms and all are close. Oh, who has not felt the tingling of mischief and crime, sweet music of generosity, and still the lingering pluck of, am I evil? Am I bad beneath it all? I am giving and villainous and musical. In my body, I carry clarity and crime and the harp. And then, again, because these are requests, this is actually a poem I don't think I've ever read out loud in public. It's called Nails, and I worked on it for a long time, and it's interesting that we're coming back to it because there was once this horrible bombing in Machane Yehuda, in the open air market in Jerusalem, and I found myself running down the street. I was running down the street, okay, running away, because what happens is, what used to happen was there was like a second round when the first aid workers arrived. There would be a second round, so I knew that I had to get out of there because there might be a second round. So that's what was happening. So I ran into a bookstore. True story, a bookstore, and I wasn't the only person who decided that this would be a good time to go into the bookstore and just wait it out, just wait it out. And a man really did hand me the book of Isaiah and recommended it. So that was this moment. Of course, I had read it before, but I just thought about that a lot, about how he felt that was an appropriate reading suggestion for that moment. Okay, so this poem is called Nails. Nails. Right after a bombing, I'd walk and walk and walk and stare at the ancient stones, some covered in moss, all coated in a light somewhere between holiness and rose white. And a spare song would come to me every time as I waited to hear if someone who was mine was now gone, now slime and smoke and ash. Sometimes the song was comprehensible, sometimes not. Sometimes the rat poison nails scattered by the bomb made it impossible to think. But not tonight, not this night of nights. How is this night different from other nights? That's what I was taught to ask as a girl. That's how I was taught to remember Exodus, the great parting of the sea between slavery and freedom, beast of burden and breathing human. If I answered now, if someone stopped and bothered to ask me, how is this night different from other nights? I'd say, or I'd sing, maybe I'd tap it against the stones. Tonight we are all aged, worn from the wrinkles of nails lining this street. Tonight we are too afraid to sing, to clap, to become happily toothless and slowly old. Tonight, a fat religious man in the overpriced bookstore on the corner of King George Street handed me the book of Isaiah and said, "This is a nice edition." And it was. He was flushed with flesh and belief in words. I thanked him, ran home to hear the latest of the ancient, thinking, why not read something so old it doesn't matter? And in the background, the fires engulfing all of us, here, now, still alive. I waited for the call. I waited to be told the deadline. This was one of those nights when I was paid to interview Jerusalemites, to ask my neighbors questions with no answer. How did you feel when you heard? Was there something different, some feeling you had that tonight was different from other nights? And as I waited, I thought of the old story of Exodus, the old idea of a promise between God and man, God and woman. And I thought of all the singers on all the stages of the earth singing about promises unkept, promises shattered. And yeah, I think, sometimes when you watch the news, you don't think about how inappropriate these questions are. It's like people who've been through a lot and they just ask you well, how did you feel? It's like, people are in shock. And so I'm going to close. The second to last poem I'm going to read is called What Remains, again, because it's a request. And I think I was sharing that I've thought a lot about aftermath, how, everybody's a human being and things stay in your mind even years later. So this is about that. This is about, because I worked on this book for so long, some of the poems became thinking about Isaiah instead of, because when I started writing them, it was the present tense. And then as time went on, I found myself thinking back. So this is a poem that I wrote pretty late in the game, about thinking back about what I had seen and what I had thought about. It's called What Remains. What remains? Sometimes in the night, I still hear it. A gun emptying itself into the fields, a bomb erupting in the vegetable market as the first bargain hunters arrive. After all these sunburned, tired years of fighting prophecy, battling Isaiah, whose song streamed into my ears at all hours as I struggled to write my own world and swallowed the sour seeds of cowardice and let them be songs. The dead poets have already left us all they knew of earth and flesh. And from inside the thick white beyond, they sing with whitened lips and translucent throats. Listen closely, mortal one. To live is a form of music. And then the last poem I'm going to read, I'm actually very moved that this was a request, because this is the last poem that I put in this collection. So Andrea, I don't know if I can't remember if it was Andrea or Adriana asked about this. This is a poem I took out, and Luke Hankins, my wonderful editor, can confirm that this is a poem that we put in at the very last minute, as in weeks ago. And it's called Reading Isaiah as My Grandfather's Granddaughter. And I guess it brings us back. I thought a lot about, my grandfather was the only survivor of his entire family. And I guess I was thinking about that at the very end, and just perspective. So it was interesting. I took it out, and then at the very last minute, I put this very short poem back in. It's called Reading Isaiah as My Grandfather's Granddaughter. God will have mercy on Jacob despite it all. So there's hope for us humans, something soothing in the offing. After all, Isaiah says Babylon's destruction will mean salvation for Jacob. Tell me, Isaiah, does redemption always mean destruction of another? Is that what you mean? Just hope as hard as you can that you are Jacob. Or maybe it just seems that way to me, the grandchild who should not have been, whose great-grandparents died so fast in the snow on the border between lands and destinies, the girl whose grandfather escaped on the last boat at the last minute, in the last breaths, before the Mediterranean became red, before shame forever polluted the blue water. Thank you. And actually, I think this gives me a lovely chance to ask Adriana a question, because I've been thinking about that. My grandfather left Germany on what turned out to be the last legal boat. He didn't know that at the time, but that was it. That was it. And I think Adriana, Van Wen's family, you're also talking about people who escaped by boat and who were also this close to a disaster, and what that is about. So I thought that was sort of an interesting connection. It was sort of a strange connection to two books. Adriana, I wanted to ask you about I'm so intrigued by your life as a translator and as a scholar and as a writer. And I wonder if you could talk about how your work as a translator has affected you as a reader. How has it changed you as a reader of poetry?
Yeah, I think it's changed me enormously, partly because it's very strange. I think because sometimes I have to explain to poets who ask me if I can translate them, or if someone wants me to translate a poem for them, that it doesn't really work that way for me. I can't just sort of, you can't just hand me a poem and I can translate. I mean, I know that I can move the words around and I can, but there has to be something more. And the way I usually describe it is that this is what happened with Van, for example, or with this poet that I'm translating, Tahel Frosh, that I'll be reading their works in Hebrew, and I'm reading it in Hebrew, I'm absorbing it in Hebrew, and then there's this little voice that starts to sort of distract me. And it's the voice that's starting to say the poems in English, but it's not a translation. It's something else. And then for me, the translation that now I have to do, because I want to capture this thing that I'm hearing, that's what my attempt to sort of get to what happens there, to that voice that I'm hearing. And sometimes I never quite get to that kind of the sort of interior translation that was summoned for me. So I know that sounds very untheoretical and very abstract, but that's how it works. And so I think one thing now that I've been doing translation poetry for a while, I can see that I pick poets to translate that really push me out of my comfort zone, which means that I want to learn something new. And I want to feel vulnerable and scared. And so that's why I love the line in the, why don't you write in Hebrew? Because I'm afraid. I think there's always an element of fear, that's actually quite productive. So with Van, I think part of translating her also required that I step out of my comfort zone as a reader of poetry. I always feel like I'm only as good as sort of what I'm reading as a translator. So I would try to find works that I felt like I would give me the kind of language that I'm looking for. So I was reading a lot of contemporary poetry. One press that I find really does that for me, like takes me out of my comfort zone, is Action Books. They're an independent press, also based in the Midwest. And their poets, I always find them just completely jolting in the best way possible. And so I think that then by the time, I'm done translating a poet like Van, I've now sort of expanded my reading of poetry, and that's really exciting. But it takes a while. It's a process. But so I do come out of it as a different reader, and that's kind of what I want to have happen anyway. So that's always one of the objectives, is that I want to be also transformed by this.
So
yeah, it's so interesting. Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
It was funny. I was just thinking about in that translation, the way you explained it, and I'm sure the other translators may have a different perspective, but I'm sure it's an element of it. Is there, when you're translating, is there a mood that you're trying to translate? Are you trying to evoke the feeling that you got, or the feeling that the poem gives you? Do you know what I mean? Are you trying to give that to somebody else in the other language?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I know sometimes hearing poetry read out loud is so different from seeing it on the page. But I think when I'm reading Van's work out loud, I'm reminded again about how quick she is with she doesn't really have easy transitions. She zooms in and out. She'll start on, jumping between three beds, and then suddenly you're in this other space. In her New York poems, she moves within a poem from like balconies to a train track. And so part of the challenge there translating her is that I want the reader to experience this kind of sometimes very disorienting movement that is happening within the poem in the Hebrew. But with each poet, it's going to be different. But I'm big with movement. It comes up a lot when I talk about poetry and translating poetry. I'm always thinking about, how is someone going to read this? How will they read it on the page? How will they read it out loud? And what will be sort of the bodily experience of the poem? So how about you, Avi?
So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Well, and I'm not sure if this is related to the same thing we were talking about just now, Adriana, but in the poems, especially some of the ones that you select, you can you refer to singing and song, and I'm curious if that, and I don't know if this is right, if it's a cantor in Jewish, in the temple. So it's is Isaiah a cantor in that sense? Is he it's sort of I'm curious because you refer to him as a crooner, so now I'm envisioning Isaiah as sort of this Frank Sinatra-esque, very charismatic, sort of leading people in terms of his words. So I'm just curious how that, because there's this vision that's stuck in my head when you.
Yeah, well, I love the idea that Isaiah inspires all kinds of visions and all kinds of readers. There's something very visual about Isaiah in addition to very oral. It's very, very interesting. And I certainly think that Isaiah could pack the house. If there was Madison Square Garden, I'm sure he could fill every seat. But I would say, like, one of the things that I was about is that, so in synagogue, Isaiah is chanted. It's sort of like a song. It's a song. But I think maybe, Andrea, I think you're picking up on something that was really important to me, like deep in my heart. Something that's interesting is that, at least in Orthodox synagogues where I grew up, only men get to do that, So it's like a lone man singing. And when I was growing up also, I was never, in school, I was never allowed to sing alone. And I think that was something that I thought about a lot, coming to to writing. It's like, do you have the right to write this? Do you have the right to speak? Do you have the right to sing? And I think in my mind that sort of a prohibition on singing, I think, was something that I thought about in connection to poetry. And I think it was related to my interest in anger. Isaiah is allowed to rail about things. And I think, we all know that in contemporary society, that sort of screamathon is not something that everyone in society is allowed to have. And I thought it was so interesting that, if you're like a woman yelling on the bus, that's like ugly, right? But in Isaiah, it's beautiful. And I found that very interesting. I found the idea of anger as beauty. That really stuck with me. So the singing, I think it was related to trying to find a place as a woman in the tradition. I hope it's okay. I wanted to ask Adriana a question, and Andrea, it's related to you had this beautiful word when you put this event together. You said allyship. A conversation about allyship. And I wondered, Adriana, I have a two-part question for you. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about whether you see translation as a form of allyship. And also, I'm interested in your feeling on translation as being sort of neither inside nor outside. Because I thought that one of the reasons I very much wanted to begin conversation with you is I thought both of us were looking at the Hebrew language and at Israel and Jewish tradition from unusual angles. So the Vietnam angle is definitely not standard, right? I think we can agree, right? But I also think that both of us are multilingual and we have a unique space. And I was curious to hear your thoughts on being an ally, but also being neither inside nor outside. And I think that's also true for Van Wen to some extent. She's not totally here or there. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we had earlier today such a wonderful conversation between us about it. So I think we need to find a way to talk more about this this topic. I do think it is a form of allyship, and I think the two questions are very much connected. I think because I myself, I sort of didn't plan to become a professor of Hebrew poetry. It didn't just happen either. There's been a lot of work involved, but it wasn't, say, like the most obvious career choice. When I was an undergraduate, I actually studied Latin American literature, which felt a lot more obvious, which is probably the reason why as soon as the Hebrew ship sailed into view, I jumped on it and I thought, I'm going to do the thing that's not obvious. Little did I know this was going to really create all sorts of interesting challenges for me, but it's been a wonderful relationship, and I haven't jumped off yet. But I think because of that, I don't come, to Hebrew literature through any sort of the conventional channels. And so in some ways, I was reading Vaughn's work online. I really loved it. I connected with it and I wanted to translate it. And it was only later when I was telling people about this project that some of my Israeli poet friends were sort of grumbling. They're like, well, she's only published one book. There are more important writers. There are bigger writers you could be doing. And then I realized at that moment, okay, that's interesting. Like there's this idea of what certain people want, not just what people expect Israeli poetry written in Hebrew to be, but also in Israel, what Israeli readers think should be exported out as representative of contemporary Hebrew poetry. And so that's when I became even more determined to follow my own instincts, because I knew I was coming from a very different perspective and a very different relationship to this language and to Israel. And kind of harness that and use it to my advantage to pick poets that I think sometimes may be overlooked by other translators simply because they're not sort of fitting neatly into a certain idea of what contemporary Israeli poetry should be in translation. But then I also didn't expect that this book was going to come out this year when we've seen
Right.
such a wave of violence against AAPI individuals and communities. And so that brought this whole brings the book into this other kind of conversation, which I'm still trying to kind of navigate sort of what my role is here as the translator of this book, and trying wherever possible to make sure that, I'm not speaking for Vaughn. I'm simply, I can talk about the translations and how I did them, but also kind of honoring that she has her story and it's also her book. It's a bilingual edition. So, and finding, so I think it's tricky right now, how to sort of make sure that I'm also giving her a space also to talk about her work. Maybe not at 2 a.m. but in other places, yeah.
Well, because Vaughn is a female Hebrew Vietnamese writer in Israel. I can't think of a voice that's more important. You know what I mean? It's
yeah.
You want to hear from this person. It's such a unique perspective. So, but I want to get back to the Wolfram bomb, and there's the whole idea of the themes of Isaiah in the book, and one of the themes, of course, is justice and good versus evil. And as we talk about allyship, I want to think, one of the questions I think was brought up in from the editors or the publisher was, why politicians use biblical verse all the time. But, I think it's just more nuanced than that. And I wonder if those nuances are things that Isaiah speaks of.
Wow, what a beautiful question. That's an amazing question. I would say absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that's interesting to me in the book of Isaiah is how intricate it is. Whether it's the different kinds of animals and the parts of the animals to the different, I would say, layers of justice. To me, Isaiah asks readers to look at themselves. And I really think that's step one. What are you doing? Not just what is everyone else doing, how are you behaving, and that's the part that I think is really important in all of these conversations. And so I don't know if you could hear that in the last poem I read about reading Isaiah as my grandfather's granddaughter. It's like, should you just assume that you're the good? Are you sure? Are you sure? And I think that's part of the eternal power of Isaiah. So while he rails against villainous behavior and evil behavior, there's a lot of, have you not heard? Have you you not seen? Have you not asked? There's a lot of reflexive language that I actually think is really necessary in our culture and in our moment. Before attacking, but ask, what am I doing? What am I doing? What role do I have in this? I think is an essential question to ask, but it's also an ancient one. And to me, that's part of the complexity. I would say one of the things that's interesting to me about Isaiah is there's a lot of pain and acknowledgement of pain, of violence, of poverty, of misery, but eventually it flips to comfort. And I actually think part of that comfort is in its insistence that you face yourself. Because I don't think you have to do it at some point. So to me, absolutely, the intricacy of Isaiah is that he flips it. And I find that very important, very, very important. And without it, it's all railing. So it's an anger, but it's also a questioning and a self-question.
I want to say in the last poem about reading Isaiah as your grandfather's granddaughter, there's a line that says, "Why does redemption always have to begin with destruction?" or something to that effect. And it's sort of the thing that you're talking about, like you have to break things down, and I don't know, and that's sort of the ultimate allyship where you're talking about. You have to sort of look at yourself and say, what am I doing? And it doesn't necessarily apply exclusively to translation in the sense that you're giving voice for somebody else in another language, but also and as we talk about allyship, because that word is sort of used, this is Pride Month. So how do we add, how do we layer, how do we translate, how do we go within ourselves and say, okay, how can I bring more to the table? And almost, I don't want to say man speak, but and that's in a negative way, but in terms of speaking for or speaking up is the word I'm looking for. Speaking up for somebody else is part of the translation, and you're giving that language another body, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think translation is that. Translation, it's a beautiful way of thinking about it, right? There's two languages, and then translation's a third creature. What is it? What is it? But without it, millions of people can understand each other. So what Adriana is doing here is really incredible, but she's linking Vietnam and Israel and the English-speaking world. That's amazing. And to think, and it makes you think, I guess just because I'm obsessed with aftermath, I think that's very interesting. There was the Vietnam War, right? The Vietnam boat people, like all of that. But these are real people, and there's aftermath. And I think that there's personal aftermath, but there's also linguistic aftermath. And just as Robert Pinsky gave me this beautiful advice of Hebrew moving into English, I think also, if you look at the language of the literature of the Vietnamese diaspora, feel Vietnamese moving into these other languages. And I think that a translator is uniquely positioned to help us understand that, to help us understand the movement between languages and between history and personal reality.
So just out of curiosity, because it occurred to me that the Bible is a translation, because I've read it in English, but I'm assuming that you were brought up reading it in Hebrew.
Totally. Yeah, I spent I read it in Hebrew, and honestly, I did not encounter the entire Bible in translation until I was 29 in graduate school, and I was shocked. And that's how the Grammar of God happened. I truly did not process what it meant that millions, if not billions, of people were reading a translation as the guide to their lives. I didn't understand that. There were always aspects about America that I never understood. And I just assumed that they were incomprehensible. And then when I started to read these translations, I was like, oh my God, it comes from biblical translation, these understandings, or some of the laws, some politicians and their positions. And I'm like, where are they getting this from? And then you read the translation, you're like, oh, now I understand. So I would say the translation of the Bible has had a massive effect on the world. And I encourage everyone, even if you don't read Hebrew, to read multiple translations to see the power of translation and to see what that's like. I think everyone should read a translation outside of their home tradition. So I always encourage Jewish, I hope this isn't too blasphemous, but I always encourage Jewish readers to read evangelical translations. I think it explains a lot about contemporary politicality. And I encourage, Christians to read Jewish translations and just to see what's up, because it explains a lot. And it also makes you realize that some of what you believe is a translator's decision. And that is mind blowing.
Well, yeah, considering the most common version of the Bible is the King James Version, and that was definitely influenced by the time. So, but as interesting, I want to keep going because there's so much to talk about. That little bit alone now is just mind blowing. It occurred to me that the Bible is the translation. I was like,
you're like, whoa.
Yeah, I was like, I feel like I need to learn Hebrew suddenly. But I want to thank Adriana and I want to thank Aviya for being with us this evening. Again, my name is Andrea Change, and I am the director of the Guild Complex. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you have not had a chance to buy Wolflam Bomb, the links to buying it through Seminary Co-op is in the chat. You can link on them and not even have to step into the store. They'll ship it right to you. Certainly, there's an opportunity at some point in this world to bump into Aviya and have it signed, because I have my copy signed. I admit I can't read everything that you wrote, but I
know my handwriting's terrible.
But the Guild Complex is a literary arts organization, and our goal is always to sort of bring new voices, unheard voices, and give voices an opportunity where there wouldn't be any. And how often do we get to hear a translation from a Vietnamese poet, Vietnamese poets writing in Hebrew in English? And then just this wealth of information about Isaiah is amazing. So I'm intrigued, and hopefully for those, and you all are translators, a lot of you are translators, you'll get a chance to dive deeper into this work. I want to thank you all again for joining us. Thanks to Adriana. Thank you to Aviya for giving us this honor. The Guild does not work without donations. So if you have enjoyed yourself and you so see fit, buy the book, make a donation to the Guild Complex. You can go to our website, guildcomplex.org, for more information about our events. And I want to let you know that our very first official live event will take place next month. It will start the way it ended with our One Poet, One Poem event, which is our Palabra Pura event. Every year we invite all of the participants from Palabra Pura to come back and take part of it. The last event that we did was in February of 2020, and that was the last time we were all live together. So on the 21st of July, we're going to meet again at our usual place at La Burkina and celebrate being together again live for the first time. So if you can join us, I look forward to seeing everyone. Thank you so much, and you have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you all.